Hi there, welcome to Killer in the Family podcast. I'm your host, Clare Laxton. So this is really exciting as well because it's the first video episode of Killer in the Family podcast. So please like, subscribe and comment as well. The story we're going to talk about today was recommended to me by on an Instagram thread, on a Crime Junkie podcast Instagram thread. So thank you so much for the recommendation and let's get straight into it. On the 17th of February 1970, police received an emergency phone call from Jeffrey Macdonald, who was in the Army Base of Fort Bragg. He said he'd been injured and his wife and children had been injured as well by a group of intruders. What police found was Jeffrey's wife Colette and their two children, Kimberley and Kristen, dead with multiple stab wounds and blunt force injuries. Jeffrey himself had a few stab wounds but was still alive. Called one of the most litigated cases in US history, Jeffrey was eventually convicted for the murder of his wife and children, maintains his innocence to this day. This is the story of Colette MacDonald, her children, Kimberley and Kristen. So as I said, this is one of the most litigated cases in US history. So there is inevitably loads of media information out there about what happened to Colette, Kimberley and Kristen. For this episode, I've relied on news stories, documentaries and podcasts, specifically an episode of True Crime All the Time podcast, a crime stories documentary incidentally hosted by Richard Belfer from Law and Order SVU, a book called Fatal Vision by Joe McGuinness, and another book called Wilderness of Errors by Errol Morris. So as usual, all my sources are listed in the episode notes. And sort of as usual, most of these sources focus on Jeffrey, his life and what happened to him, rather than talking about Colette, Kimberley and Kristen, their lives and experiences. And hopefully this episode will change that a bit. It is a particularly tough listen, and as usual, sources of support and information, if you need it, are in the episode notes as well. And I think it is really important to say, like a few of the episodes we've talked about before, there is great contention about what actually happened to Colette and her children. Some people believe MacDonald is guilty, and that includes Colette's mother, Mildred, stepfather Freddie, and Bob Stevenson, Colette's brother. But others believe he is innocent, or at least that there are still some questions that haven't been answered yet. I'm not really here to convince you either way, but to talk about Colette and her children, centre her and remember them. So Colette Catherine Stevenson was born on the 10th of May 1943 in Patchogue, Suffolk County, New York. She was born to parents Edward and Mildred Stevenson and had a brother called Robert or Bob. Now, sadly, when Colette was just 11 or 12 years old, her father, Edward, actually took his own life. Now, I couldn't find loads of information about what had been going on in Edward's life, but his wife, Mildred, did say that he suffered from insomnia, as well as some health conditions, such as like a heart condition. He was just 52 years old when he took his own life, though, and I just can't imagine the impact that this had on Colette, her brother, and her mother. A couple of years later, Mildred met Alfred, or Freddie, Kassab, and they married in 1957. Now, Freddie would become a really important part of this story. Colette attended Patchogue Medford High School, and once she'd graduated in the early 1960s, she attended Skidmore College in Saratoga Springs, which, although still in New York State, was about just over 200 miles from where she grew up. On the Crime Stories documentary, Colette's sister-in-law Vivian described Colette as always putting others before herself. She believed in marriage and having a family and was just really looking forward to having that in her life. Now, Colette actually met Jeffrey Macdonald in their high school. And in some sources, they're described as high school sweethearts. And while they did date at high school, they broke up. And it wasn't until they were both at university and college that they began a relationship. Jeffrey Robert Macdonald was born on the 12th of October 1943 in Jamaica, Queens, New York. His parents were Mac and Dorothy Macdonald, and apparently his father was quite authoritarian, though not physically violent. And Macdonald was, a really popular guy in high school. He was voted most likely to succeed, most popular, and was crowned prom king in his senior prom. So that's like a really important thing in sort of American high school culture. and he went on to high school to study medicine at the very prestigious Princeton University. It was then that him and Colette rekindled their friendship and started dating. Now, in August 1963, Colette announced that she was pregnant with his child. She dropped out of college and they married on the 14th of September that year in New York, the honeymoon on Cape Cod. And apparently MacDonald was also dating other people when Colette became pregnant, so it must have come as a bit of a surprise to him and her. Now, Kimberly Catherine MacDonald was born on the 18th of April 1964 in New Jersey. She was just 5 years old when she was killed. Now, a year later, Colette, Kimberly and MacDonald moved to Chicago, where he attended Northwestern University Medical School. And Colette and MacDonald welcomed a second daughter on the 8th of May 1967, Kristen Jean MacDonald. She was born in Cook County, Chicago, and was just 2 years old when she was killed. Now, once he'd graduated from medical school, MacDonald joined the US Army in June 1969 and actually volunteered for the Army Special Forces. So they're so-called the Green Berets, because they wore green berets, unsurprisingly, and he became a Special Forces doctor as well. So in August 1969, the MacDonald family all moved to Fort Bragg, a big military base. It was the headquarters of the Army Special Operations, covers 250 square miles, currently has a military population of over 50,000, and it's now actually called Fort Liberty. So at the turn of 1970, I'm sure many would have looked at Colette, MacDonald, Kimberly and Kristen and thought they were living a wonderful family life. The American dream, if you like. He was a doctor serving the army. She was at their home in Fort Bragg, bringing up their 2 children. And Colette was also pregnant with their 3rd child, their first boy. So this is going to be a very tough listen to. In the early hours of 17th of February 1970, around 3:30 a.m., dispatchers at Fort Bragg received an emergency phone call from Jeffrey Macdonald. He said that there'd been a stabbing. Now, military police thought they were initially responding to a domestic disturbance, so were probably not prepared for what they were about to walk into. As they entered the property on the very rainy night, they had to enter around the back. They saw Colette MacDonald, clearly dead and sprawled on the floor. Ken Micah, one of the military police that attended, told the Crime Stories documentary that not only were Colette, Kimberly and Kristen dead, but they were brutalised. He said that he still had nightmares about that. Colette had not only been beaten around the head, but had also been stabbed 21 times with a knife and a further 16 times with an ice pick. Her trachea was severed in 2 places and both her forearms were broken, presumably from trying to defend herself. The police then found Kimberly, who was on her bed. She had also been bludgeoned around her head and had between 8 and 10 stab wounds. She was also dead. Finally, they discovered 2-year-old Kristen in her bed with her baby bottle by her side. She was also dead and had been stabbed 33 times with a knife and 15 times with an ice pick. That just feels really difficult to comprehend. They found MacDonald laying on Colette, injured himself with stab wounds, but still alive. He claims that he was sleeping on the couch in the night because Kimberly had wet the master bed, and he woke up to Colette screaming and Kimberly screaming as well. He said there were 4 people in the house, 3 men and 1 woman, and they were saying things like acid is groovy and kill the pigs. He was trying to fend them off, but lost consciousness. And before we talk about what happened any further, I just want to talk about the injuries here. To me, the injuries inflicted on Colette, Kimberly and Kristen is a classic case of something called overkill. Overkill is when the use of force goes further than is necessary to achieve murder. It is strongly linked to the killing of women by their intimate partners, and the Femicide Census report from 2020 found that for 55% of women who'd been killed by a man, overkill had been employed. In an article by The Independent about this, Jess Phillips MP, friend of the podcast, talks about a neighbour of hers who'd been killed by her partner and had 81 injuries on her body. An overkill clearly happened in this case. Between Colette, Kimberley and Kristen, they had nearly 100 injuries. That is total overkill. And as I said, it's associated with the killing of women by an intimate partner, by intruders or burglars. Furthermore, we have to talk about the fact that Jeffrey was not dead. Yes, he had injuries, but they were not life-threatening or life-ending as they were for Colette, Kimberley and Kristen. If you were an intruder or burglar breaking into a house, wouldn't your focus be on the biggest threat? I.e., wouldn't you go for the adult man over the 2-year-old girl? I do think it is suspicious that Jeffrey escaped from that house, but his wife and 2 children, who personally I don't think probably pose much of a threat to a group of intruders, were not only killed, but killed so brutally and violently. It's important to note as well as a family had been murdered, the police also found the word pig written in blood on the bed headboard in the master bedroom. Now, as a Guardian article highlights, the sort of American culture in the 1970s was very different to what we see today. The Vietnam War had created a bit of a subculture of disillusioned young people, and the word pig being written on the headboard was reminiscent of the murders of Sharon Tate and her friends committed by Charles Manson's followers in Los Angeles just months earlier, where they had written pig in Tate's blood on the front door of where the murders occurred. So back to that night in the crime scene. The investigative team started their investigation and collection of evidence, and MacDonald went to hospital to recover from his injuries. Now, according to a Vanity Fair article, as investigators assessed the crime scene, they noticed how much blood there was in the bedrooms, but not the living room. And there was very little disturbance in the living room, despite MacDonald saying that's where the intruders sort of committed their crimes. There were also lots of fibres and hairs that they collected from Kimberley and Colette and Kristen, and blood samples as well. Interestingly, and something that apparently MacDonald didn't know, is that each family member was a different blood type. So in this time where actually DNA testing wasn't available, it was still possible to track what had happened to each of the family members. Now, at this point, investigators were starting to have some doubts about everything that happened that night and it happening the way that MacDonald said it had. So again, this Vanity Fair article talks about the evidence that they collected from the crime scene that night. So they collected fibres from MacDonald's pyjama top, which was found on top of Colette. They collected fibres underneath Kimberley's sheets and in Kristen's room. I think it's also important to highlight that the pyjama top that MacDonald said he hadn't been wearing when he went into daughter's room because he'd already laid it over Colette. They'd collected evidence of a bloody footprint leaving Kristen's room. They collected MacDonald's glasses, which had blood on them, that turned out to be Kristen's. But again, MacDonald said he wasn't wearing his glasses when he went into her bedroom. They found tips of surgical gloves that had been used to write the word pig, and they were identical to gloves that they found in the kitchen cabinet. And outside the back door, they found an ice pick, a kitchen knife, and a bloody piece of wood that was about the size of a baseball bat. Testing would find all of these had been used in the murders. There was also an Esquire magazine in the living room that had a story on the Manson murders, and police started to theorise that maybe this is where Jeffrey Macdonald got the idea from to talk about the intruders. So, that's also not to say that there weren't errors in evidence collection. Apparently loads of people were allowed in the crime scene and, risk of contamination was big there. Apparently later on as well, and I have no idea how this happened, but some of the fingerprints and the footprint were destroyed somehow. But despite these errors, investigators were looking squarely at MacDonald for the murders. There was another complicating factor for investigators, though, in a woman called Helena Stokely. She was a blonde woman who could be described as a hippie. She was local, and she also used substances. She was questioned many times over the coming years about whether she was involved in the murders, giving credence to MacDonald's story. She sometimes said yes. She sometimes said she wasn't sure. And she sometimes said she wasn't. And she was given polygraph tests as well, which showed different results. So while it's still not clear what the truth is about Helena, her presence and questioning did add credibility to MacDonald's story. But at this point, MacDonald was put under house arrest in April 1970 and faced something called an Article 32 hearing, which is the military equivalent of a grand jury investigation, basically. And throughout this time, both Colette's mother, Mildred, and stepfather, Freddie, believed in his innocence, and they stood by him through the Article 32 hearing. The hearing started in July and was apparently one of the longest Article 32 hearings in US history at that point. Now, after hearing about the evidence and from witnesses, presiding officer Warren Rock dropped all charges against MacDonald, saying they were not true, and recommended an investigation into the 4 people that Jeffrey said were there. Sadly, this is nowhere near the end of the search for justice for Colette, Kimberley, and Kristen. MacDonald was then honourably discharged from the army. He sold all of his family possessions at a yard sale and went to continue his life in New York. He also immediately started looking for a journalist to tell his story and started quite the round of media appearances. It was his appearance on the famous Dick Cavett show which caused the most furore. I've included a link to a short clip from the show from December 1970, just 10 months after his whole family had been murdered. He's laughing and joking and basically talking about and complaining about how he was treated. Dick Cavett actually said years later that he thought MacDonald's affect was all wrong. He wasn't the devastated husband and father, but seemed to be enjoying his infamy. And it also turned out that despite having the appearances of a perfect and happy marriage, MacDonald had had many affairs during the marriage, and affairs which Colette knew about. She actually complained and talked about them to her sister-in-law Vivian, and had told her mother to expect her and the kids to come and stay with her soon, as she wanted to leave MacDonald. I think this is a really interesting development, as we know separation in a relationship is a very dangerous time for women and children. So I wonder if that could have come into play for MacDonald, maybe. Anyway, it was after the Dick Cavett show appearance and other media appearances that Colette's mother and stepdad started wondering if their son-in-law was as innocent as he professed. They started asking themselves, how could he move out, sell all the family's things, and basically start a brand new life? He had a girlfriend, a new job, was sort of living his best life. I totally agree here and think that for someone whose whole family had been killed, they would be dedicating their life to finding who had done it, and bringing them to justice. But apparently he wasn't that bothered. I can't with this guy. And Bob Stevenson, Colette's brother, was absolutely aghast at his appearance on the Dick Cavett show and talked about how he just couldn't believe how MacDonald talked about how his rights had been violated, but nothing about his wife or daughter's rights and life. He actually said he thought it was a disgusting performance. So with Freddie and the rest of the Colette family no longer believing in MacDonald's innocence, they started campaigning for justice. Freddie wrote to everyone he could think of, politicians, media, everyone that could take up this case. And in 1974, after Freddie and Mildred filed a citizen's criminal complaint against MacDonald, a grand jury was convened. In January 1975, they indicted MacDonald for the murders and he was arrested. He pled not guilty and was bailed for £10,000. Now, it would be another 4 years before MacDonald actually faced criminal trial for the murder of Colette, Kimberley and Kristen. And that was because after he was arrested, he lodged an appeal based on double jeopardy, where you can't face trial for the same crime twice, because he had his Article 32 hearing in the military. But the Fourth Circuit judges rejected this appeal on the basis that there wasn't a guilty or innocent verdict found in the Article 32 trial. So finally, on July the 16th, 1979, the trial of United States versus Jeffrey Macdonald started. Now, I'm not going to go in the ins and outs of the trial, mostly because it just puts more focus on him. But I will talk about what the prosecution thought happened that night. They stated that they believed that Colette and Macdonald late that night sort of got into some sort of an argument, and Colette hit Macdonald maybe with a hairbrush or something like that. And he hit her back with that bit of wood that was the size of a baseball bat. They thought that Kimberley came into their bedroom to see what was happening, and she was hit by that piece of wood by accident and fatally injured. They said Macdonald carried Kimberley back and then stabbed her those sort of 8 to 10 times. And at this point, they believe Colette is said to have sort of woken up from being knocked out and gone into Kristen's room, presumably to protect her. And Macdonald went after her, hit Colette many times with this piece of wood. And then they state that Kristen was the last one to die and was the only one that Macdonald was really premeditated about. He stabbed her with an ice pick in the front and back many, many, many times. They then sort of said that they think Jeffrey stabbed himself. As a doctor, he would probably know how to do it without killing himself, to puncture his lung, but not to kill himself. And the pyjama top that we talked about earlier was a really important part of the prosecution case here, because Macdonald claims that he was wearing it and it was removed during the attack from the intruders. And then he laid it over Colette after he found her injured. However, the pyjama top had 37 stab wounds and holes in it, which matched her stab wounds, not his. So had he actually laid the pyjama top over her after the murders, or was she actually wearing it when she was stabbed? On the 29th of August 1979, Macdonald was found guilty of the murders of Colette, Kimberley and Kristen, and was sentenced to life imprisonment for each murder. So Macdonald has been convicted of the brutal murders of his family nearly 10 years after they were killed. Sadly, this still isn't the end. Now, according to a Vanity Fair article, Macdonald has taken this case to the Supreme Court 7 times, which is a record. Now, when I said this is one of the most litigated cases in American history, I was not joking. He has lodged so many appeals, some claiming issues with the impartiality of the judge, some about the ethics of prosecutors, and some about other issues as well. All of these appeals have failed, however, and he's still in prison. And we heard in episode 18 about the family of the Longo family and the impact that constant appeals from him had on them. And I just can't imagine what Colette's family have been going through over the past decades. On a total side note, and something that really surprised me, despite being convicted of triple murders of his family in 1979, it wasn't until 1983 that Macdonald's licenses to practice medicine were revoked. I feel like being a convicted murderer is a pretty good case for an immediate revocation of any license to be a doctor, but anyway. And the last thing that I want to talk about in this episode is the attention that the case received from writers and journalists. There have been lots of books written about Macdonald, turned into a TV series, and possibly a documentary on Disney+. So firstly, Joe McGuinness wanted to write a book about Macdonald and was actually made part of his legal team in 1979, so he would have full access to Macdonald for the trial of the book. And I think at first McGuinness thought Macdonald was innocent, or at least there was reasonable doubt, but he soon changed his mind. His book Fatal Vision was published in 1983 and portrayed Macdonald as a sociopath who killed his whole family. Now, Macdonald actually sued McGuinness for fraud after the book was published. The case was settled out of court and Macdonald got a $325,000 settlement. And this is a whole other issue because criminals can't profit from their crimes. So Colette's family then took him to court seeking damages as well. Mildred ended up with getting $80,000, with the rest of the money going to Macdonald's lawyers, his mother, himself, which doesn't really seem fair. Anyway, I think it's fair to say that the Fatal Vision book didn't quite go to plan for MacDonald. And, what is it with family annihilators seeking infamy through journalists and writers? Again, this is so reminiscent of Christian Longo and the writer Mike Finkel that we talked about in episode 18. Like, they are so entitled that they think theirs is the only story to tell, and they don't think that they're going to be discovered. But as we found, both MacDonald and Longo were found out by the writers and called out by them. So after the Fatal Vision book came Fatal Justice by Jerry Allen Potter and Fred Boast. This book cast some doubts on MacDonald's conviction by looking at some of the mistakes made in the initial evidence collection. And then there was A Wilderness of Error by Errol Morris. It was a book that was published in 2012 and was also made into a TV series. Again, this book highlighted what Morris believed was mistakes made in evidence collection and investigation. And, this is something that has really frustrated me when I've been researching this case, because so many of the documentaries, books and media articles about it are not only about MacDonald and his life, but also about writers that disagree with each other and what they think of each other. So the Guardian article that I mentioned earlier on in the episode was actually focused on Errol's book and what he thinks of Joe McGuinness. It doesn't really talk about the actual victims of murder, Colette, Kimberley and Kristen. And in a case that has been the longest litigated in US history, the focus has always been on Jeffrey, his story, his personality, what he did. And then the focus shifted to what different journalists think about the case and how much shade they can throw on each other. No recent focus has been on Colette or the girls and the unimaginable horror that they faced that night. Bob Stevenson, Colette's brother, told Crime Story documentary that Freddie and Mildred also died that night. They were heartbroken, and all they wanted was the truth and justice for Colette, Kimberley and Kristen. And I really hope that this episode has helped shift the focus back onto the people who matter and hear their voices and experiences. Colette, Kimberley and Kristen were buried in late February 1970 in Washington Memorial Park in Suffolk County, New York. Mildred Kassab died in 1994 and Freddie Kassab died 6 months later. This episode is dedicated to Colette, Kimberley and Kristen, to the people they were and the joy that they brought to their family and friends. We remember them and we centre them in this episode. This has been Killer in the Family podcast, written and produced by me, Clare Laxton, with music from the brilliant Tom Box and Pixabay. I'll be back next week with another episode, so please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to send me any comments or questions on a voice note or DM to my Instagram profile at Killer in the Family Pod. And do let me know any stories you'd like me to cover as well. Until then, I've been Clare Laxton. This is Killer in the Family podcast. Until next time, take care.